Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
He's typically been portrayed as a trickster with a flippant, likable personality. And in the cartoons, let's face it, he was never a threat.
What's up, Jack? Now I got you wabbit.
So when a Toronto writer started seeing bunnies in his yard, he wasn't afraid, but he was curious. And now it's turned into a self-described obsession. I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of The Big Story, we speak to Nicholas Hune-Brown, executive editor at The Local, about his piece entitled, "Are There More Bunnies in Toronto?" Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I appreciate you hopping on the call.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little about your piece. What sort of precipitated this for you?
A pretty simple thing. Last year we saw a bunny in our backyard, and I know this is not breaking news stuff, but we live in Midtown Toronto, and it was a cute rabbit. It was in our backyard. It was, twitching its mouth adorably, and my kids ran out to see it. I've lived in Toronto my whole life, and I don't really remember urban rabbits as part of my life in like the 90s. But after we saw that first one in our backyard, suddenly I started seeing them everywhere. There was one in my in-laws' yard, and they hadn't seen one in 30 years. My neighbor hadn't seen one in 50 years. She'd lived up here in Corso Italia growing like delicious bunny-friendly vegetables in her backyard. I saw them in the alley in Roncesvalles when I was driving around. So I just kept seeing them everywhere, and I had a very simple question. I thought it was a simple question, which is like, are there more rabbits in Toronto?
Okay, so you set out to sort of get that question answered. How did that play out?
I thought that was a pretty simple question. First of all, I asked some friends, and they were all very supportive. They were backing me up. They said they were seeing rabbits everywhere. And then I tried to get some expert confirmation. I figured that like someone in the city must be paying attention to this stuff and counting it and giving me the kind of like empirical data I want as a journalist and as a person who, takes seriously my job to actually back up this stuff that I've been witnessing. So I started calling around, and I did not have a lot of luck. I called everywhere. I called the head of a rabbit rescue place, and they just said, no, we don't track this stuff. I called experts at the zoo who look at local wildlife. I called Ontario Nature. I called an academic who actually has all this motion detection technology that she uses to record wildlife in Toronto ravines. And she said that she suddenly noticed bunnies recently, but she'd actually turned her cameras off recently. And then I called the Toronto Wildlife Centre, and they were like a little blunter with what they thought about this question. They said, I'll quote, like, we are not counting rabbits, and I can't imagine anyone else is either. From our perspective, nothing seems different in the rabbit world. And then she added, and it felt like pretty pointed to me, I do get this question pretty much every year once the babies start leaving the nest and are more visible. So that felt like, maybe it would be a good place to stop this bunny obsession. People said they weren't noticing them. But for some reason, it made me want to just dig in like even deeper. So that is what I did in a way that probably is like not that useful to what I should be doing with my job, but I just had to know more.
Yeah, I'm sort of laughing as you're outlining this. It was the non-answer that turned this into an obsession, correct?
Yeah. I don't know. I felt, are these people bunny gaslighting me? Like, I've seen so many of these creatures. All my friends are seeing them. There must be something there. It did give me pause. I thought maybe I've just created my own like weird bunny bubble where I keep talking about bunnies everywhere, and then people are coming and telling me about bunnies, and I'm just seeing one individual creature pop up in my backyard over and over again. But I don't know. I wanted an explanation for like what I thought I was seeing, and I guess I wanted like some justification for my own like increasing obsession and affection for these little creatures that kept stumbling into my path.
Did you do any research sort of outside the city of Toronto? Because I know it feels like, anyway, I'm seeing other bunny stories in Canadian cities.
I wanted to keep it local, but to do that, I needed to learn more about like the bunnies we were seeing in general. So I started speaking to experts in the States and across Canada who have like researched the eastern cottontail, which is the rabbit that we have here, and kind of trying to learn a bit more about how it even came here, which ended up being fascinating. Like they, kind of think of them as always around, but they actually came with humans in the sort of late 19th century. They're an animal that does really well in the places between nature and domesticated places. So like in the hedgerows, the places where they can be out in a farmer's field eating their grass and then running to safety when predators approach. So they actually followed us towards this area in the late 19th century. And then, speaking with experts and looking at newspaper archives, I slowly looked at how they came to my neighborhood, I guess.
It sort of says something about living together in cities, right? And how space is shared and some of the accommodations, I guess, that the wildlife make, or the benefits that the wildlife get from being, sort of close to humans.
Yeah, I think, mostly we are, I think, terrible for animals, the presence of humans, but there are some animals that do well in the places between where we've paved over nature and where we've kind of let nature creep in, and the number of squirrels here, the number of raccoons, seagulls, things like that. And I think bunnies are becoming one of those creatures, at least in Toronto. I know that in other places they're everywhere already. So this feels like a weird little Toronto story where I see a rabbit and get obsessed with it, but that's what it became.
It feels like the reaction was kind of a shoulder shrug from some of the officials you called, like they don't track this and this is clearly not a thing to them.
I thought it was weird that no one was counting them at all, but as I spoke to people, I realized it's actually very difficult to do this. Like in Toronto, they track things like cormorants or frogs, and those are easy to track because you make a field recording and they make sound, and you can kind of analyze that sound and figure out approximately how many of these creatures are around. With like a wild rabbit, you would be capturing them, you'd be marking them, you'd be releasing them, you'd be trying to capture them again. And I guess that's just not worth, the bunnies aren't worthwhile, There's not enough time to do that. And to what end, right? So there isn't really data on how many rabbits there are, which was the frustrating thing that I found halfway through this journey, that like I wasn't going to get the hard numbers that I could brandish and say, see, it's not just me seeing rabbits, they're everywhere. We have stats here. People aren't keeping those.
And the other thing that's interesting in my mind, with no one tracking this, is that they can be somewhat destructive, for gardens and such. You hear stories all the time about rabbits eating things that are being grown.
Yeah, absolutely. Even one of the experts I spoke with, she works at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and a nature lover, talks about how much she enjoys seeing these wild creatures in her neighborhood. But she was also like, they have also eaten this new plant that I planted, and I really was hoping they wouldn't. And yeah, you hear about that all the time.
Was there any talk from anybody about any kind of, rabbit birth control? Because we all know the saying about rabbits and their procreation practices.
No one's mentioning that. And I think to begin with, people have to, they think to to actually agree that there is a rabbit boom. The only rabbit birth control that anyone talks about is predators, right? Like I began getting into more fundamental things about what controls rabbit populations, and that is mainly, it seems, in most cases, the presence of predators. So foxes really like eastern cottontails. Coyotes do sometimes. So you think about what that balance might look like in an urban setting, and those are interesting questions to think about. A huge boom of rabbits this year could mean more foxes next year. I'm not sure.
Right. Because we do have foxes and coyotes in Toronto as well.
We do, yeah.
Since you published this piece, have you heard from people reaching out maybe with their experiences or their theories on maybe what is going on?
Yes. This was a silly piece, Kris. Like I got obsessed with a rabbit I saw in my backyard, And I decided to report it out as fully as I could, and ended up digging into Hudson's Bay Company fur trapping data and talking to renowned experts in kind of hare and rabbit populations, and did all of this work, and published it kind of as a lark. And I've gotten more responses to this bunny story than any piece I've done in the last couple of years, probably. Like more and more serious, important stories. Like people have been noticing bunnies, and people have their own theories about what they are seeing. And my inbox is filled with so many pictures of eastern cottontails in like across the GTA, in a way that I find very gratifying as someone who recently became obsessed with them. So yeah, I've been hearing from people. They're saying things like they're thinking about the coyote populations. They're thinking about wet springs, which are good for rabbits, which does make sense to me. They're thinking about my own theory around this, which is just that I think in recent years, and over my lifetime, the city has not been rewilded, but it has become in certain places a little bit wilder. Like you take my neighborhood, which is in an old Italian neighborhood in Midtown Toronto, and 20 years ago it was many paved patios, very nicely trimmed lawns, and gardens at back. And that era is shifting. Like you're seeing more wild gardens. You're seeing people are doing no mow May, where they're not mowing their lawns for all of May to help pollinators. You're seeing kind of like a little bit more wildness creep in, and I think rabbits are probably among the first beneficiaries of that wildness. So that ended up being my theory, and I spoke to a leading biologist, and he thought that sounded reasonable. So that is as close as I've gotten. But I'm hearing more and more theories around it, and I'm interested in all of them.
Any efforts that humans have made to respect wildlife and the health of our communities could be adding or increasing the rabbit population. Fair?
I think so. That's what I came to. That's my best theory. I think there's a lot of other things, and there's some randomness, and there's some couple of wet springs in a row. But I think that I know that my backyard has become more rabbit friendly. Like we saw this rabbit. My kids ran out. They've become obsessed with it. And midway through May, I was like, I have to cut back all of these dandelions and clover and grass is getting insane. And my son, who is obsessed with animals and is the only one on the street who will be, looking up at a red-tailed hawk or something while everyone's going about their day, he jumped in front of the lawnmower and was like, no, we can't cut it. This needs to be for the bunny. So we've kept like a corner of it pretty wild. And I imagine that same process, like maybe not exactly like that, but little patches of wildness happening across the city. And those are places where bunnies are thriving.
So I have to say, as a fellow journalist, I admire your tenacity around all of this. But I just want to go back to the beginning because I'm curious. Did you actually get an answer to your question? The headline on your piece, are there more bunnies in Toronto?
Listen, I knew that headline would make some people unsatisfied as they search through. I can't say with 100% certainty. I know in my heart that there are more bunnies in Toronto, but I do not have someone with a PhD or an official title telling me that they know as well that there's 100% more bunnies in Toronto than ever. I'm going to keep looking though. I think there must be, and there must be ways to be able to say for sure.
That was going to be my next question: is this obsession over? But it doesn't sound like it.
I mean, it should be over. I spend too much time asking a question about rabbits when there's a lot of important things happening in our city that I should be covering. My coworkers, my wife, people were, slightly shocked that I was spending my evenings looking at 19th century Hudson's Bay fur trapping data instead of, covering the Ontario government or whatever. But I'm still interested, so I'm going to keep thinking about this.
All right. I will look to you for a definitive answer at some point in the future.
Thanks, Kris.
Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem.
That's Nicholas Hune-Brown, the executive editor at The Local. And I think it's safe to say there's likely more to come from this hair-raising tale. That wraps up another episode of The Big Story. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.